Name's Alan Wake. I make a living by taking nightmares and turning them into neat chapters. This one didn't want chapters. It started with a steering wheel shaking in my hands and wet road smell in my nose. A cliff road, black water beneath, a lighthouse far off like a nail of light hammered into the sky. I hit a man. That's what the thud was. I got out, chest tight, breath smoking in cold air. He didn't bleed. He leaked shadow. His face was there, and then it wasn't, like someone smeared him with an eraser made of night. He came at me with an axe, and the wind sang around the blades of furze. I ran, because survival beats pride every time. The lighthouse kept blinking, on, off, like it couldn't make up its mind about saving me. The road peeled away under my shoes, houses folded like cardboard sets. A voice, my voice but not, said to keep to the light. I hit the lighthouse door shoulder first, slammed inside, and reached for the knob to the lantern room. The dream split down the middle like a zipper. I woke to a fairy horn, my wife's camera clicking, bright falls sliding into view under a clean blue afternoon. We went there to fix me. No book tour, no interviews, no stabbing questions about why the last book wasn't as good as the one before it. Bright Falls looked like the kind of town that sells mugs with its name on them. A diner with a stuffed deer, timber trucks grumbling past, the smell of fresh sawdust and coffee. Inside the diner, a waitress named Rose knew my work like she'd underlined it. She thrust a marker and a menu at me, hands shaking, cheeks pink. She said, "Mister, Stucky had my keys." Only Stucky wasn't there. An old woman in black, gloves, veil, the works, glided out of a corner where the light seemed to give up. She pressed a key into my palm and said the cabin on Cauldron Lake was ready. Her voice felt colder than the metal. We drove over as the sun slid down and hid behind the ridge. Bird Leg Cabin sat like a splinter in the lake, an island with a narrow bridge, windows filmed with dust. Inside, floorboards complained. The place smelled like old paperbacks and damp wood. Alice took my hand and led me into a study. She'd set up a typewriter, a lamp, fresh paper like snow. "No pressure," she said, but it was pressure. I hadn't written a word in 2 years that felt right. I joked about allergies to deadlines. She said she just wanted me to try. I heard my own voice getting sharp, the kind that cuts people you love without drawing obvious blood. Then the lights died. Every bulb. A blackout that fell like a trapdoor. Alice screamed. It was that specific sound I'd heard when she woke from a nightmare in our apartment. The sound that tells you someone is drowning in a room with no water. I went for the porch, flashlight up, heart already sprinting. She screamed again, high and thin from the dock. A shape toppled into the lake. Splash, white hands, a camera skittering. I dove. The water was thick and cold and wrong, not wet so much as heavy, like sinking into a story that didn't want you. The tape goes jagged here. The next clean image is a windshield cracked like a spider web and my chest wrecked by a seatbelt. Rain hit the hood hard enough to sound like nails. The forest leaned in too close. My phone was dead. My watch told a time that didn't match the sun. Later, I learned a week had gone. I didn't just lose an evening. I lost 7 days like loose change through a holy pocket. I staggered onto a dirt road, the kind that wins and pretends it's going somewhere. A page slapped my leg, stuck by rain. It was from a manuscript titled Departure. The author line was my name. The words on the page were mine, my cadence, my lazy similes, my favorite crutches, only I didn't remember writing them. I read about events that hadn't happened yet. A flashlight would fail, a tree would fall, a voice would call me by name from the wrong direction. I felt my scalp prickle like it was trying to crawl off my head. I found a gas station. The owner, Stucky, lurched out with the smoothness of a puppet on the 10th take. He wasn't drunk. He was occupied. His words came out like broken bottles. Behind him, men in rain gear drifted from the tree line, edges blurred, eyes most noticeable because the rest of the faces couldn't decide if they existed. They swung axes and pipes. When I hit them with the flashlight beam, something peeled like bark coming off a dead tree. When the light bit deep enough, a bullet could touch the person underneath. I didn't want to line up any clean headshots, but the rules didn't care. Light first, then lead. Otherwise, the darkness was a coat you couldn't shoot through. Calling them taken came later. At first, they were just problems I solved with batteries and panic. I learned to worship street lamps. I learned the sound of a generator coughing to life is better than a prayer when the woods start talking with a voice you know isn't yours. Sheriff Sarah Breaker sat me down under hard office lights and read me back my own story. Car found wrecked, no one in it, a writer with a reputation for drama, a lake with no island on it since a volcanic event decades ago. She said there was no cabin on Cauldron Lake to rent, hadn't been for years. I told her what I knew in my bones. I'd slept there, tasted its dust. She didn't call me a liar. She didn't have to. Her eyebrows did the work. Barry Wheeler arrived like a one-man emergency kit. Neon jacket, louder voice, enough cologne to baptize a moose. He hugged me and asked where the cameras were. When he realized there was no prank, he started making everything worse and better in the same breath. Barry believed me because believing me was his business model, but he flinched when the lights flickered. He didn't want to, but he did. Then the phone rang, a voice like wet gravel. "We have Alice," it told me. "Bring the manuscript if I wanted her heartbeat to keep doing its job. I went because you go." The man who met me, Mott, was local trouble with a flashlight he used like a crown. He threw his weight around and called it a plan. He wanted pages I didn't remember writing. He said his boss wanted proof I could deliver. He kept walking us deeper into night like it was a favor. The pages on the road were the only map I had. They said there'd be an ambush here, a floodlight there, a chainsaw somewhere I didn't want it. They told me I'd make a mistake and trust the wrong whisper. They told me Barry would show up with Christmas lights and a plan I'd hate. They all turned out right. That's the trap with prophecy. After a while, your feet learn the steps, whether you agree or not. Emil Hartman ran a lakeside clinic for artists and called it treatment. He reached out with the soft hands of a man who never chopped his own wood. He said my problem wasn't monsters, but creative control issues. He said the town was full of the kind of inspiration people fly across the world to find. He said Alice contacted him because she was worried. The last part landed. It always does when you love someone who's watched you unravel. The clinic smelled like pine cleaner and secrets. Paintings stared with eyes too wide. Patients shuffled past sunlight like it had fine print. Hartman wanted my pages. He wanted me to lean into the process, which is therapy for hand over the steering wheel. Night came down and the generators coughed. The glass in the hallway went black, not dark, black like ink poured into water. The taken moved in with the patience of a flood. Hartman's voice went from calm to cracked. Barry made an entrance through a window holding a flare like a cigar, screaming that he was my lit agent. We ran. I kept finding pages. Between paragraphs that guessed the future, a name appeared like a lifeline. Thomas Zane, a poet, a diver, a ghost in rubber gear, haunting local memory. Decades ago, he tried to write his lost lover back from death, and instead opened something that shouldn't have a door. He cut himself out of the story, literally wrote himself gone, to keep it from spreading. Before he left breadcrumbs for whoever followed his path. I was following it. Maybe that was the problem. The Anderson brothers, Odin and Tor, lived at the clinic and at their old farm in spirit if not body. Retired rock gods, their tour bus rusted in a field between busted amplifiers and cases of fireworks. They told me the lake had power. Feed it words and it feeds you reality, but everything comes with a hook in its belly. They said to find the Lady of the Light. They said it like a chorus line they'd been rehearsing for years. When we got to their farm, night was already halfway through the door. Taken rolled in over the wheat like a storm front. Barry found a stage and a switch. Guitars howled through battered speakers and floodlights cut the dark to pieces. I fought from spotlight to spotlight while Odin and Tor's old anthem blared, something about gods, lightning, bad choices, and louder amps. It should have been ridiculous. It was survival. Burn the shadow, then break the thing wearing it. The smell was wet bark and hot metal, and a memory of my first book tour panic tucked under my tongue. Lady of the Light turned out to be Cynthia Weaver, a woman who turned the water department into a lighthouse that never slept. She moved through banks of switches like a priest moving through candles. She called me by name like an appointment she'd been keeping for decades. Thomas Zane had told her I'd come. She'd been collecting bulbs and rules ever since. She led us to a bunker she called the well-lit room. The walls hummed with electricity. It felt like standing inside a living lamp. That's where she gave me a small plastic thing on a cord. She called it the clicker. She said it was a key. In my head, a childhood memory rose up like a photo in darkroom chemicals. My mother giving me a toy light switch and telling me monsters couldn't cross if I kept it with me. The memory felt too clean, too convenient. That's how I knew it was probably true in Bright Falls terms. True because the story needed it. Agent Robert Nightingale showed up, waving a badge and calling me by the names of writers he hated. He smelled like bourbon and a recent argument. He wanted me in cuffs, and he didn't much care if I was the wrong guy as long as I was a writer. He chased us into a clearing where the dark was waiting like a stagehand behind a curtain. 1 second he was shouting, the next he was gone, his flashlight rolling in a circle like it was asking which way to go. The pages had promised it. They were right again. By then the pattern was impossible to ignore. The lake wasn't a lake. It was a machine. You put story in, and it pressed your words into the world, like wet clay stamped with your fingerprints, and the fingerprints of whatever lived under the water. It always took its cut. The darkness wore the face of Barbara Jagger, Thomas Zane's lost love, because it liked puppets and nostalgia. It had been at the diner in a veil. It wanted me to write a door, big enough for it to leave. It knew what I wanted, too. I wanted Alice back. Pages for the kidnappers wasn't the answer. They weren't even real kidnappers, just men who thought they were driving when the dark had already grabbed the wheel. I had to do what Zane did and beat the thing at its own rules. I had a key. I had a name for it. I had a plan that sounded like madness and felt like the only honest thing left. We drove back to Cauldron Lake. The island wasn't there because the island didn't exist anymore by the town's rules. But the lake had other rules layered under the surface, like old wallpaper showing through. The wind died. The water flattened. The pines made that whispering sound I will always hear in my teeth. I wrote myself a bridge, quick and plain. I didn't give the dark extra words to twist. I crossed anyway. Down there, directions quit. The dark place felt like walking through a house built out of rewrites. Walls shifting, doors opening on rooms that were my memory but not. I saw my study, but the dust floated wrong. I saw our New York apartment with the sound of the ocean behind the walls. Alice sat at a typewriter, and when I called out, my voice came out of her mouth. Barbara waited in the cabin, a woman-shaped absence with a smile like a crack in plaster. She spoke in the voice of drafts under doors. She said she could be reasonable. She said endings were negotiable. The clicker was small in my hand, a toy that weighed as much as a confession. I turned it. The sound, a cheap little plastic click, went down through the floor and out into the lake like a nail through wood. Light came in, not like sunshine, but like an idea getting its way. It hit Barbara, and the shadow peeled off her like old paint under a heat gun. She screamed, not throat and air, but house and wind. I used the opening. I wrote the ending I could live with, not the happy one, the true one. If the lake demanded balance, then balance was what it would get. I wrote that Alice would surface, and I wrote that I would stay. I wrote a chair. I wrote a lamp that hummed. I wrote the walls thick enough to hold me. Alice came up out of black water, choking and clawing. I didn't. I felt the cabin settle like a book closing on my fingers. People say it's not a lake, it's an ocean, like it's a line from a trailer. It's just what you say when you realize you were measuring the wrong thing. In here, the lamp buzzes and the ferry horn sometimes finds me. Barry swears somewhere far away about coffee and bad ideas. Sheriff Breaker's radio crackles with codes. I write them down. If I write them down, the walls stop breathing. If I keep the light on, the dark stays where it belongs, for now. If you're listening for forgiveness, I don't have a bow to tie this with. Alice is alive. That has to be enough. I'm where I wrote myself, in a room that sometimes pretends to be a cabin and sometimes pretends to be my office. Tip the waitress who keeps an autograph book under the counter. Be kind to the woman who hoards bulbs in the water plant. And if an old lady in a veil offers you keys to a place that shouldn't exist, don't take them. Even if the part of you that writes wants to know how the next page feels.